It is a beautiful day to be alive, and I'm so glad we have this time together. I'm Sana Laybourne, she, her. I am a professor, scholar, connector, and avid reader. I've always loved learning about what's happening in our social world and sharing that knowledge, especially over a good cup of coffee. And so here we are. Each week on Let's Grab Coffee, I catch up with experts from around the world who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So go ahead and grab your cup of coffee and get ready for an engaging and insightful conversation. Boys don't cry. Man up. Take it like a man. Emotions are a sign of weakness. These common sayings shape how we think about emotions, who can have them, and what type of emotional displays are acceptable. Although 1 in 5 adults experience a mental health problem each year, men are less likely than women to seek mental health services due to societal norms, traditional gender roles, stigma, and limited awareness or understanding about the specific mental health challenges that men face. June is Men's Mental Health Month, and to help us raise our awareness of men's mental health, I am so excited to welcome back Dr. Justin K. Dodson. Dr. Dodson is owner of Navigating Courage Counseling and Consultation. He is a licensed therapist who specializes in helping adult males through individual therapy, one-on-one coaching, and group coaching. He's worked with athletes, healthcare providers, first responders, business owners, and other leaders. He also provides tailored consultation for organizations who are looking to improve their understanding and strategies related to neuropsychology and mental health issues. Dr. Dodson is the author of The Courage of a Single Freckle, Navigating Your Black, which is meant to create space for race relations, recognizing bias, and identity development. Welcome, Dr. Dodson. As always, it is a pleasure to have you here with us on Let's Grab Coffee.
It is good to be here. I feel like the resident therapist, and that feels so dope.
Oh my goodness, you're definitely the resident therapist for Let's Grab Coffee, and it's because you are amazing and you are able to break down mental health and therapy in a way that I would venture to say, and listeners, you can let me know that I am correct, that it makes therapy seem like, wow, this is something that's normal, that I want to do, that I need to do, and it's not as scary or confusing or mystified as I thought it was. So absolutely, always a pleasure to have you on. When I listen back to the conversations we've had previously, and even today, I'm sure will be exactly the same. I'm always just blown away by how you can break down, again, some of these really complex topics and make them seem more manageable, but also, again, make therapy seem very warm and welcoming.
I appreciate that. I get that a lot. And what I tell people is that I think therapists, I was having a conversation today with one of my colleagues, and I think therapists make things so much more complicated than what they have to be. And, we try to use these big words and make things way bigger than what they are. But sometimes mental health is complicated and sometimes it's really simple. So I try my best to break things down in a way that is digestible. Because if you lose people in what you're talking about, they won't come back. So I
Absolutely.
appreciate that. Yeah.
And, when folks are coming to you or other therapists, it's because they have something that they can't quite maybe make sense of on their own. So they definitely don't need anything complicated to add on to the complications that
Mm-hmm.
they're already experiencing or the complexities that have brought them to you in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. But I love what you just said about making sense of something on our own. And that's it right there. Podcast over. That's what therapy is. Making sense of something using a resource. A therapist is a resource to help you do that. Oftentimes we call friends, families like, yo, check this out. This is what happened. Should I feel? And then we're asking for permission and to be affirmed. But a therapist is really a resource that you get to use um, to bounce ideas off of, process information out loud, label things, increase your emotional intelligence. You can use it really for almost anything you want it to, as long as you do the work. So I love
Mm.
that, making sense of things on your own, but using someone to assist you.
Yeah, and I love what you said, a resource, right? When I think about, oh, I'm just maximizing my resources or drawing upon my resources, it sounds like a place of strength. And I think
Mhm.
oftentimes when people hear therapy, they think of it as like, oh, maybe there's still some stigma around it or it's an admission of weakness. But with your framing of, oh, I'm using therapy, I'm just drawing upon my resources to help, again, to help me make sense or work something out on my own, that really sounds like a strength to me because it's always great to have your resources and to be able to draw upon the resources that you need in any given moment.
Yeah. And, I think what the reality is when we talk about men's mental health, a strong man is a resourceful man.
Mm,
And because, we know historically men like to solve problems. We like to be the one to fix things, or we're expected to be XYZ in order to prove masculinity and manhood. But the reality is being strong means I know how to be resourceful, and being resourceful isn't always unhealthy and using the bad things to solve a problem. It is also tapping into things that you have around you that you can use to make you even better than what you started with, if that makes sense.
mm.
Um, and so, when you're talking about being resourceful, you're talking about building a team of people around you. So we have our gym communities, we have someone we can talk finances with. And I've talked about that before, having your mental health therapist, your physical therapist. You have some friends where you turn up with, and also, no, I have some friends where I'm like, no, I'm not going to talk to you about business because that isn't our dynamic. So being resourceful and know who to call on when, and having your therapist in your pocket too to be able to do that.
I love this mindset shift that we just already had in these first few minutes, right? Like thinking about our definition of what it means to be a strong man. And I love how you said that, like, a strong man is a resourceful man. And so already, like, reconceptualizing what it means or what part of the meaning is when we're talking about manhood versus this idea of oftentimes saying, like, a strong man is someone without emotions, right? And so just tying this all into how we're managing our emotions, feeling our emotions, but also again drawing on resources to even make sense of like what is it that I'm feeling.
Yeah. What am I feeling, and what is it teaching me? Well,
Mm,
right. So if we talk about feelings it give us information. So if I am feeling anger, and I'm just using that as an example because men can feel the whole spectrum of feelings. But if I feel anger, I have to identify, well, where is this coming from? What's contributing to it? And what is it teaching me? If I feel sadness, where is this coming from? If I'm feeling anxiety, I get to locate and use my resources to figure out, all right, let me track back. We lose something and then we retrace our steps to try to
mhm,
figure out, all right, where did I go wrong? Therapy is the same thing. Let me retrace my steps in life to figure out what has happened, or retrace my steps in a day to figure out, well, why am I feeling low? But I don't think anything has happened. Right. I think as men, we always have so much on our plates, whether we want to admit it or not, or whether we realize it or not, and we get to retrace our steps and say, all right, yeah, I said yes to this thing when I really should have said no. I said no to this thing when I really should have said yes, and knowing when to take things off our plate. So it's definitely a shuck and drive, jive, move and shuffle sometimes, but knowing that you get to use yourself as a resource to figure out what you need to do to give to yourself in that moment.
I love that. I'm just, you know, again, so insightful. I love how we have really just drawn on this idea of resource because it makes me feel empowered just to think about like, wow, I have all these internal resources that maybe I wasn't even aware of, but how can I use them, maybe to work through something that I'm experiencing now, or even to know that it's on reserve for me in the future when I maybe encounter a similar experience or whatever may happen. I also love that you even use that example of anger because I think we have to start with the emotions that maybe we can identify or easily identifiable. You talked about, what am I feeling? And maybe anger is an easy one to latch on to because maybe I've
Mhm.
learned that it's okay for me to be angry, or when I'm angry, people, respond to me, right? But then taking it one step further and saying, okay, but what is this emotion telling me? What is this feeling telling me? And I think once we're able to even just name and claim the emotions that we
Yeah.
are aware aware of, then we give ourselves space to kind of dig a little bit deeper and say, well, maybe it's not just anger that I'm feeling. Maybe it's
Yeah.
actually a little bit of guilt or disappointment or some other feeling that maybe previously I didn't feel that I had the right to feel, or that I
Yeah.
could actually claim as a feeling that someone like me could have.
Yeah. Sometimes it's embarrassment.
Mm.
Have you ever, and I don't, and I may be sidetracking right now, but have
We
you
love a good
noticed
sidetrack.
these new quote unquote dating shows on social media where they're popping a balloon
Oh my
and
gosh.
cringe,
Crin-
make cringe, hard stop. Additionally, when I've noticed on those things where somebody will pop a balloon and then they'll make a really an insult. They'll
Mhm.
insult the person, and then we have this back and forth. So, oh, you're not really angry. You're just embarrassed that this person called this out. Or
Mhm.
you're embarrassed that this happened and now it's showing up as anger. So that was the first example that I could think of that's becoming more popular. But you're
Mhm.
exactly right. It's identifying, naming, and claiming the feeling. And one thing that I can appreciate in therapy is that if I identify a feeling that I think my client is feeling, they get to challenge me and say, well, no, that's not it. It's really this. Great.
Mm.
Because you're really the expert on yourself. You're just using me as a resource to help connect the dots.
I love
Yeah.
that idea too of sometimes we don't even know exactly what it is that we're feeling until we hear somebody kind of put a label on it or suggest, oh, it sounds like you're feeling XYZ.
Hmm.
And oftentimes I can at least speak for myself. In therapy, it happened to me today. My therapist was like, oh, it sounds like such and such. And I actually had like a kind of physical reaction of like, no, that's not it. Right. Like I felt it in
Right.
my body first and then verbalized and was like, I really think, that's exactly it. But I think it also, that example speaks to you in your practice making a very safe and comfortable space for somebody to say, well, no, I don't really think that's what it is.
Yeah. I always tell people from the first call, therapy is not a dictatorship. And if you're sharing space with me, I am humbled by that. I am grateful for it. And we're also going to do some work, right? There's a challenging dynamic to that where sometimes you leave session exhausted.
Mm,
Sometimes you feel liberated and powerful. Sometimes you feel sad, right? So there's really this range depending on what you're showing up with and how we chop that work up in the 50 minutes that we have. But the
hmm.
goal is to leave and do something with that, not
Yeah.
just feel it for that moment, but to actually put some actionable steps in order to see me less and less, because
Mm,
that's the goal, to see your provider less and less over time. And you may see them a lot in the beginning to get the momentum going and you have more regular sessions, just like when you're starting with anything else in your life. And then over time, you're really going to see them less and less. And then future reference, I just know, hey, I can go to doc to handle this or that when it comes up 6 months from now, a year from now, because life does change. So
hmm.
this maybe not be the best analogy, but it's almost like having an attorney on retainer, right? I
Hmm.
have an attorney. I may not use her every month, but I know that when I need something done, a contract reviewed, I know who to call.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, as I was listening to you kind of explain, really give an overview of what the therapy process is like, I think again, another resource, right? And I think that illustration really shows how therapy is a resource, right? It's not necessarily something that you're going to do for the rest of your life every single week, right? But
Hmm.
instead, you're going to learn some new strategies, learn some new tactics, practice them. And then the better that you get at them, you will need your therapist less and less on that, maybe weekly or biweekly basis. Instead, as you mentioned, maybe it's every couple months or when something particularly challenging comes up where you're like, you know what, I've exhausted all the resources I have internally. Let me, hit up my therapist, this external resource, and kind of dip
Yeah.
back into this practice in order to make the best decision, with whatever it is that I'm facing.
Yeah. And I will say that the thing that I do want people to understand is that when you start with a provider,
Hmm.
you really do need to keep it regular. So whether you're agreeing to weekly or every 2 weeks or monthly, whatever you can financially and mentally uh, invest in, do that regularly, and then have a conversation with your therapist to say, all right, I think I have what I need. Or your therapist should be saying, you know what, you actually executed your goals. Let's look at thinning this out some. So that's
Mm-hmm.
really the process. And then maybe that gets ramped up a little bit in a couple of months or 6 months or a year down the line. So I do want to bring attention to that. You want to do it regularly if you choose to invest in therapy. And then
Mm-hmm.
over time, you will probably use that resource less and less.
Yeah, I love that reminder because as you mentioned, with anything new that we're starting, we want to make sure we have a very strong foundation for that.
Yes,
So
yes,
deciding
yes.
what that schedule is in the beginning, making sure we're consistent with it so that we actually can strengthen that resource. We can strengthen
Mhm.
and continue to do that work that's going to be really important outside of the actual sessions that we may have.
Yeah.
I love that you mentioned social media and so many cringeworthy dating shows are out there, but I think also gives us an opportunity perhaps to see ourselves reflected in some of the storylines or some of the people that we're also seeing on these dating shows in particular. And it made me think when I did your intro and I talked about all these different people that you've been able to talk with or work with, I did not mention you also had an opportunity to talk to a reality dating show, a personality, Clay from Love is
Yeah.
Blind. And I thought that was such an amazing moment because, again, here's this show that millions of people are watching and trying to make sense of. And you, as a therapist, are also observing this and probably noting some things in the interactions and how everything is playing out. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about both what we may have seen if folks are watching Love is Blind, and then also some of the conversation that you were able to have with Clay as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I have to keep this in mind too, because I recognize when we watch TV, we absorb what's happening and we can get really invested. And I
Yeah.
and I think what we have to understand when watching shows like that, it's an experiment first. It's an
Yes.
experiment to see how human beings will respond to one another in this study, right?
Hmm.
If we look at it from that perspective, how am I going to respond to not seeing somebody, only hearing them, getting to know them, keeping track of that? I'm separated from my real life and I'm choosing to enter into this experiment for whatever reason that may be,
Hmm.
right? And I think that that's important to recognize. And then everybody's going to see it from their different perspective. I think at the time they had maybe over 45 billion streams of the show.
Wow.
And you have so many different people of different walks of life, different traumas, different experiences watching this and interpreting it in real time. And I think one thing that I learned from even having the conversation, the IG Live that I did with Clay, is that at that time, it really seemed like he had done the work. And when I
Mm-hmm.
say done the work, people talk about mental health, they talk about therapy. But based on his responses, I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I hope that we can give people grace as we go on because shows we have favorites and everything feels like you have to pick a side. But the reality is we don't know these people personally. This is a
Mm-hmm.
show. This is for our entertainment, and this is their real life, whether they walk away with love or not. They truly chose to do this thing for whatever time period in their life. We get to look at it, make sense of it for ourselves, move on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's really the big takeaway.
Yeah, I love that reminder of like this is people's real life. We get to observe it. And in a way, I think that can also be dangerous when we are consuming other
Mm.
people's lives for our entertainment. And oftentimes we aren't able to, practice sympathy or empathy or give any type of grace because we've kind of almost dehumanized those folks in the process.
Yeah, and so then we get busy judging the characters on the show and choosing sides. And it's so interesting when we did our Instagram live a couple of months ago, people were commenting. It's amazing how people feel so entitled to give their opinion on something. You should ask this and you should ask that. Well, that's not how that works. That's not how that works. And what if we kept conversation positive? And what if we kept it about keep the main thing the main thing? I think that's where we lose. That's why I didn't respond to a lot of the things. And
Hmm.
by no means do I think that I'm some public figure, but I'm thinking, Jesus, is this what people go through on a regular basis when they make things public,
Mm,
everyone having an opinion about something, it's wild. And
yeah.
I can see how people's mental health is really impacted by that.
Mm-hmm.
And scouring comments and looking for what's negative or what's positive to affirm you and latch on to. It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you bring up a good point because even though we may not be public figures, the majority of us are on social media to some extent. And depending upon, what social media platform we're on and maybe the settings that we have on our account or on our profile, we definitely open ourselves up to potentially having people provide those, unsolicited opinions and
Mhm.
oftentimes, very harmful and hurtful commentary as well because social media is such a big part of our lives, and we see this particularly with younger people too, a lot of conversations around bullying and things like that. I'm wondering if there are any type of maybe approaches or strategies we should use when managing our social media or even just thinking about, what we post, the way we interact with people.
Absolutely. I can't remember where I read this study, but it was talking about that over 80% of individuals on social media talk about themselves, and another 80% of individuals compare their self to someone else on social media.
Mhm.
But that same study talked about people not feeling satisfied in their life. And so my rule of thumb for social media is to use it for entertainment. I want to be able to laugh when I open my phone, use it for education. I want to be taught something, no matter if it's a life hack on how to clean something or something that's been hidden all of our lives. And then I want to be inspired. And
Mhm.
so I always tell people, if I always do like a social media feed cleanse,
Mm,
where once every, I don't know, a couple of times a year, I just go through and unfollow certain pages that don't do any of those. They don't
mhm,
inspire me, they don't educate me, they don't entertain me. And I think that that's a really good way to make sure that you, as much as possible, control the content that you are absorbing. Because what I've learned, especially about some people that I've worked with in the past, is that social media can be beautiful and so good, and it can also be a very dangerous place. And when I
mhm,
mean dangerous, you have bullying, like you mentioned. You also have a lot of exposure to pornography and a lot of
mhm,
exposure to sexual content. And whether we want to admit it or not, a lot of men over consume sexual content, and it's right there on your explore page. And
mhm,
even though it's meant to be entertainment, if I am a man and I don't have the capacity to always be exposed to that, and that's a trigger for me to then go down the rabbit hole of doing other risky behavior or unsafe things, then I need to clean it up as much as I can.
mhm, mhm,
Screen time, we really want to be able to reduce our screen time to at least 2 hours a day to make sure that we can. So studies say that if you keep your screen time 2 hours and under, you can decrease symptoms of anxiety and depression, which are both associated with more social media use and consumption. All right. So if I'm looking at social media and I'm comparing myself, and then I start to feel down on myself and I feel, well, dang, how did he get that brand partnership? How did he get this? How did they get this? Man, he has the family, the car, the girls. But the reality is that people can make anything look how they
mm,
want it to look on social media. So when you talk about strategies, I think keeping that screen time down, doing a cleanse of the content that you consume, making sure the content you consume is entertaining, educational, and inspirational, and then also keeping the reality check of people are where they are, and I have no idea what they did to get there. This looks good, but I may not even be willing to do the work that it took to get there, but then you're feeling jealous of what you think you deserve versus them.
mm.
So I think keeping ourselves in check is really important when we're talking about managing our mental health and social media.
Mhm.
Yeah.
As you were talking, it made me think about because you mentioned how, decreasing our screen time also potentially decrease anxiety and depression. And I know that data presented by Mental Health America says that depression and anxiety are two of the five major mental health problems affecting men. Um, but I noticed that when they were talking about depression, that they said how depression shows up for men it looks different than how it shows up for women. And in particular, it says like men, it might look like fatigue or irritability or loss of interest in work or hobbies, rather than in women, it's often these generalized feelings of sadness. And I'm wondering if it could talk a little bit more about depression in men, because I think without a firm understanding of what depression might look like or even feel like, there might be men who are suffering with depression, but think like, oh, this is just maybe what it feels like to be a man, or like this is okay, or I could power through it. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So oftentimes, I love how you say irritability because it does show up oftentimes in men with being irritable,
Mm,
short-tempered. And then we look at that as being angry when the reality is I'm really sad and feeling disconnected from things. Can't quite put my finger on it. I've been feeling disconnected. I don't want to hang out with people. I just go to work, I go home. I go to work, I go home. And a lot of
mm,
men relinquish and give up a life in order to be the quote unquote man they think they're expected to be. But then now I've let go of my community. I've let go
mhm,
of my gym. I've let go of time on the court where you're playing ball with the friends, right? And so you give up this life to live this lifestyle that fits someone else's acceptance. And before you know it, you're feeling sadness more days than not, right? So
mm,
even when you look at clinical depression, you're really looking at this onset of symptoms for at least a few months or more, right?
mhm,
So when we talk about everyday mental health, some days I feel good, some days not so good. Mental health is really looking at how we cope and respond to the world around us on a regular basis. How do we tap into those resources? Mental illness, you're looking at clinical depression because mental illness is a diagnosable disorder. So
mm,
your anxiety, your bipolar, your depression. And I think it's important for people to know that you can have a mental illness and still thrive, right?
mhm,
Someone with bipolar, which is a mood disorder, can still thrive and live a great life. Someone with poor mental health who may not have a diagnosable disorder can struggle on a regular basis.
mhm,
So that's one thing to note, but depression can show up with us feeling irritable. It can also show up as brain fog, where we're not really thinking clearly. We can't communicate in a way that we need to. We're feeling disconnected from things that we've been interested in before. And before you know it, you really forget that you have a life because you're really not familiar with the person that you're looking at anymore.
mm,
And that happens more days than not. And so, one instrument that we or assessment that we use is the PHQ-9 to assess for that at the beginning of therapy. And then we're using that as therapy persists to see if that number has gone down over time to see if we need to change course of what we're doing. So, there are tools and things out there that we can use on a regular basis. I've even seen people come into my office and they're like, yo, I did this assessment online. Is this true? Well, I don't know. Let's redo that together. Let's see what's out there. But depression is a real thing that shows up in men. The unfortunate part is that we don't often know how to label it as
mm,
depression. So I'll get an intake and we'll fill out the documents. It's all right. Well, you are saying, well, I have irritability. I'm tired all the time. I'm not sleeping well. My appetite isn't the same. I feel disconnected. But then it's like, oh, but I'm good. Couldn't be.
mm. Yeah.
Couldn't be. You just couldn't be. There's no way. And so getting back on track. I always like to
Mhm,
say I help men get back in the driver's seat of life and feel in control again because when we do have symptoms like anxiety, depression, or some type of addictive personality or thing that we're dealing with, we feel less control over life, but we use that very thing that
mm.
makes us feel shame-ridden and low to compensate and cope for that feeling. So then it becomes this cycle
Yeah.
that we need to get out of in order to get back in control.
I love this idea of being able to find or tap into the resource so that we have a better way to feel that sense of, I don't even say sense of control, but more so just a greater sense or a greater way to identify what we're feeling and what would be most supportive of who we
Mm,
want to be and how we want to show up in the world, versus just simply like getting everything under control because we know everything is going to be all over the place all the time. But it is about how do we cope or how do we manage or even how do we maybe set a plan in order to get things back on course.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so that's hopefully what people will do if you choose to invest in therapy to create a plan to help you get back on course.
Mhm.
If you choose not to do therapy, right? So we still have this stigma that we're dealing with where I've seen in many cases where people show up for a call and they're like, oh, I'm just here because my friend said I should, or my wife or
Mm,
my girlfriend said I should. Well, do you want to be here? Because it starts with that. If you don't want to be here and you're only doing it to please someone else, that doesn't make sense. But if
yeah.
you want to be here and invest in it, let's make a plan to see you get back on course. If you choose not to invest in it because of whatever reason you have, then still make a plan for yourself. All right, I need to do this, this, and this. The downside to that is you're only holding yourself accountable, and that may have not gotten you anywhere in the past. So part of
Ooh.
it is really interrupting the pattern of behavior that we don't want to see anymore.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that piece about accountability, because I know a lot of us think, oh, we can do it all ourselves, and we've been successful maybe in other arenas of our lives, doing things ourselves and taking responsibility and accountability, maybe in this one aspect of our lives. But there are definitely certain areas where we need that external person, that professional to hold us accountable, but also to offer us some different tools than what we've been using, right? You mentioned
Yeah.
breaking patterns and habits. If we could do it on our own, we would have already done it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's like, well, how did that work out for you when you did that? Oh, not well. Okay, cool. Bet. Let's see what we can do. And also give yourself a chance to really get it right.
mhm,
You can try on different things, and sometimes maybe meditation doesn't work for you, or maybe you really have been meditating but it doesn't look like this picture you think it's supposed to look like. Maybe your
mhm,
meditation is taking a walk or praying or expressing gratitude or taking a long shower. It doesn't have to look like I'm chanting something, I have incense going, right. I think the misconception about meditation is that, all right, I'm gonna make my brain stop. That is
mm.
impossible. That is like me putting my hand on my heart and say, all right, heart, stop, slow down.
Right.
That's not how the way the world works. We are slowing down our thought process and trying to focus in on our breath, our
Mhm,
positive thoughts, our healing, paying attention to being grounded in the world to get back to equilibrium to make sure that we can manage and respond to whatever is in front of us.
mhm. I love that idea of, hey, it doesn't have to look like what may have worked for a friend, right? It doesn't have to look like
Mhm.
maybe what you found on Google, or it doesn't have to look
Yes.
like what you saw on social media from that favorite therapy account that you follow, right? And
Yeah.
that I think is the importance and the value in starting a therapeutic relationship for yourself, right? With a provider one-on-one versus trying to like piecemeal it together from, different resources or sources that we might have available, which I do think is great that we have more access to kind of
Yeah.
exploring. But at a certain point, we do benefit from having that tailored one-on-one experience, especially if we're already curious, right? If we're curious, we're like, we want to kind of delve into this for ourselves. Then I think
Yeah.
we do owe it to ourselves to actually commit to it and get the best help possible.
Yeah, and I like what you said there, where access, right? So these self-help books, journals, you log on to social media, all of those things give us access to something else. But the reality is, wouldn't it be nice to have something tailored to you
Mm.
that is just for you, your time in the week to carve out and relax and focus in on you to check in with yourself. That is the beauty of investing in a provider for yourself to carve out that time just for you. Because, especially as men, when do we really do that? If I am going to work and I am going to home and I am paying bills, when do I really carve out time for myself? I always tell people if that means you need to take a longer way home just to have some time for yourself, bust that block a couple of times. Hit it, you know what I'm saying? And sit in the car just a little bit longer if that's what can be restorative to you. But truly, all right, 50 to 60 minutes at a time. Sometimes therapists offer 45. Lock in just on you. And I think
Mhm.
culturally speaking, the man cave was that thing for men when we think about a long time, but that also was associated with sports, alcohol, cigar, and crap talking. What if we had a man cave, but it was a therapy session, and
Mm.
you really focused on not using substances that made you feel tired and low, but 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 talk about things that actually help build the type of person, like you said, you want to see.
Mhm. I think it's so great that you kind of point out, like we have traditionally thought of the man cave as the man's escape, and also within that idea of a heterosexual relationship, right? So there's a lot of things packed into
Mhm.
that that may not be the
Yeah.
healthiest or accessible or practical or desirable, right, for folks. But within that, as you mentioned, how have we been conditioned to think me time or taking care of myself actually looks like engaging in some behaviors that maybe aren't that restorative and aren't that
Mhm.
helpful and might be actually fueling some of our bad habits.
Yeah.
So again, I think that's just a great reminder to kind of pause and say, okay, what is it about? What do I normally do to quote unquote cope or dissociate? Or what is it? What are parts of my daily routine that maybe if I actually kind of take a step back and look at it, I'll realize, hey, actually, this is not, this doesn't make me feel very good. Or every time
Mhm.
I engage in this activity that's supposed to be fun and relaxing, later on, I actually don't feel great. Or the next day, I'm not feeling as energetic or, whatever the case may be. So I love that idea of even just interrogating some of the things that we've incorporated in our life without maybe even thinking about, hey, is this actually, again, helping me be the person I want to be, helping me show up in the ways that I want to show up?
Yeah, I like the word that you use there, interrogation, right? That goes back to this idea of tracking back. How did I get here? Man, I cannot get up today for work. What? Oh, I was smoking last night. Oh, I had too many be okay, got it. And you get to track back and figure out what contributed to this. What can I do differently? Do I have the willpower, the resources, the skill to try to interrupt that so that I don't end up there? Now, I'm not saying that there's not a time and a place for certain things.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not gonna say that if you saw me out Friday night, I may not be having a drink. But I
Hmm.
also recognize that I have a limit. I know
Yeah.
that the older we get, the more that just bloats me, makes my head hurt, makes me feel dry, right? So there's really what feels like for a lot of people this expiration on, all right, I gotta grow up and do something different or learn something else in order to show up how I want to be.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, again, a lot of the things that we kind of have been doing or the habits that we have, there might not be anything inherently wrong with it, but maybe just for the phase we are in our lives, or again, who we want to be now, or even just like our own bodies as we age, it's just not the
Hmm.
most conducive to the lives that we want to lead. So I also love that reminder, right? It's not necessarily that something is wholesale bad for us, but maybe it's just not the most supportive at this moment. So I
Yeah.
really love that reminder. As we were talking earlier, and when we were having that conversation about depression, and when you said like for men, it might be irritability, which might be coded as anger, an emotion that men are allowed to have, right?
Hmm.
And so maybe you don't interrogate that any further because you're like, oh, it's fine, right? Because no one is going to push back on you if you're angry. It made me think about something else that I read in terms of some of the mental health problems that we see affecting men. And one that was listed was eating disorders. And that really jumped out at me because, and again, the data from Mental Health America said that men account for an estimated 10% of patients with anorexia or bulimia and an estimated 35% with binge eating disorder. And it made me think, I wonder if like that 10% number of anorexia and bulimia is really low, honestly, because men maybe don't seek help for an eating disorder, or we've kind of coded eating disorders as something that women have. And so we're not even kind of like looking for it within men or even, considering that. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe eating disorders kind of broadly or binge eating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I am again podcasting. You got it right. You hit the nail on the head. And so I'll go back to this idea of social media, right? Because I
Hmm.
think that for many of us, like I follow a lot of fitness profiles because it fits in my category of inspirational. I'm
Hmm.
looking to see what products you're using. I'm looking to see what your routine is to see what would work for me and what would not work for me.
Yeah.
But a lot of men actually have what we call body dysmorphia, where they don't
Mm.
see their body in a healthy way and they're not rooted in reality of what their body really looks like. And
Okay.
you often do see that in athletes, wrestlers who have to cut weight, boxers, people that have to be a certain weight in order to perform the sport. You also see that in bodybuilders or some of your favorite influencers where, bro, you're really dehydrated.
Mm.
And oftentimes we see it as a joke where I'm showing up to the gym dehydrated because all I've had was pre-workout, but we're really not nourishing our bodies, but we're doing that as a sacrifice in order to meet a certain aesthetic that we think is pleasing
Mm-hmm.
or good. So I always tell people whenever you see statistics regarding adult men's health, adult men's mental health, the numbers are typically going to be skewed because it's not capturing the amount of men who are actually dealing with that, but
Mm-hmm.
unwilling to be honest about it because there
Right.
still is that stigma regarding any mental health issue. And even for you to talk about eating disorders with men, that is such an uncharted territory of a discussion regarding men's mental health because typically, if I say eating disorder, you typically think white teenage woman or
Mm.
young adult
Yeah.
woman. You really do. And I think and that is just the reality of it. If I hear the word alcoholic or drug addict, I'm typically thinking of somebody that looks disheveled and not put together. You know, we have this stigma associated with these terms, but someone that has alcoholism or an addiction can look any type of way,
Mm-hmm.
well resourced, well traveled, well spoken, gets up and goes to work every day. So it doesn't have to fit this thing. Someone
Mm-hmm.
with an eating disorder doesn't have to look malnourished and skinny and small. They could look like jacked
Mm-hmm.
and all these things because they're over exercising, under eating, and all those things to meet this thing. So you're exactly right. I think that eating disorders in men is a under discussed phenomenon and the
Mm-hmm.
numbers are more than likely skewed, but it is a real thing.
Mm, yeah. I mean, when I think about again, like just some of the issues that we see that men are dealing with, it always makes me consider, okay, how can I maybe be not even just on alert for the men in my life, but also maybe create a space where it's okay for a man to have an eating disorder, right? For to not be dismissive of some of these, or it's okay if a man is feeling sad or crying or joyful, or a lot of feelings that oftentimes I think we don't allow men to actually express and to have without ridicule, right? And so I'm always thinking about, what else can we all do individually to kind of change the narrative around some the emotions that all of us feel, and then also, not just individually, but then what are the things that we need to change in our society, of course, to be supportive of that as well. But one thing that I love about having you on the show is I feel like for listeners, we're all able to take away maybe one or two nuggets, if not a whole dozen, to say, okay, these are some ways that maybe for myself, I need to seek a therapist, or these are some things that within myself I need to interrogate, or also like for people that I'm in relationship with, these are maybe conversation points that I can then incorporate or things like that. The eating disorder one just really struck me because it actually made me think about my dad. And when I was growing up, like my dad was on every diet that you can think of, my dad was on it at some point. But I just think about like eating disorders and like binge eating and how, of course, he never went to a therapist to talk about like what is the source of wanting to control your eating or feeling like out of control with your eating. And something that I'm sure people in his life, myself included, were just like didn't give a second thought
Yeah.
towards.
Yeah. And sometimes we see eating disorder because of what we've been exposed to. So in clients that I work with, it's because they had parents who owned a gym and
Mm,
parents who had a certain aesthetic, or they're always commenting on the weight of their child or the way that they look and the way that they present. So fast forward, that sticks with me. And that is traumatic, right? A lot of
mhm,
people think, oh, if you were abused, that was trauma. But truly, the way that your parents treat you can be traumatic. And
mm,
when we break down the word trauma, it doesn't have to be this overcomplicated thing. Trauma is when something happened that shouldn't have, or when something didn't happen that should have. the way our parents talk to us, the way that they treat us, the way that they affirm us or don't affirm us, all of that is a sign of what can be traumatic, because what happens is that we grow up and we internalize that and we use that as our guide to be or how not to be. And
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes that can lead us to, for example, eating disorders or depressive state or being in unhealthy relationship or developing unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is really important to take a look at.
You talked about family, which makes me think about like so much of what was normal in our family maybe wasn't actually that normal or not even normal, but that healthy. And I think that can be honestly one of the challenges sometimes is realizing like, oh, this actually shouldn't have happened or it shouldn't have happened like this. Because that wasn't really the healthiest perspective or habit or action. And I think that can also be a bit jarring, right? When you
Mhm.
realize, like, oh, maybe things that again that you should have had that you didn't have as a kid or things that were happening that shouldn't have happened as a kid and now trying to reconcile like what does that mean maybe for even how I think about my family and thinking about my childhood. So I can see sometimes that there are some challenges once we start to really kind of trace back, right? Where
Yeah.
do these beliefs come from or where did these habits come from?
Yeah, yeah. And that's where we get into epigenetics, where
Mm,
we absorb over time the patterns of behavior and belief from generations before us. I'll be honest, when I was an adult before I realized, oh, my anxiety comes from my mom. I
wow.
inherited that from her. I mean, full live, out of college, adult, out of
Mm.
my first graduate program before I couldn't, I think I was maybe driving on Poplar. And I was just checking in with myself and I realized, oh, ooh, wait, that's what that is. That's where that comes from because of the behavior that was modeled for me.
Hmm.
Hearing her being stressed about finances, seeing her in certain capacities in the way that she was willing to go over and beyond for certain people to make sure that they were okay, and being parentified at an early age, all of that helped develop this anxiety in me. So I would get in crowds of people and I'm like, all right, why do you feel so jittery? That's not
Mm.
cool. Why are you sweating before you do this thing? Because it was modeled for me. So when we look at eating disorders or other things, let's even take a guy who doesn't really know what life looks like outside of work and home. So, well, that's what my dad did. That's what my granddad did. Yeah, but how full is their life? What
Hmm.
do they like to do for fun? What brings them joy? And we get in the habits of those things. So parents always teach us how we want to be and how we don't want to be. And we get to take from that and create a life that we want to live. So even people that say, oh, well, my pops did this and that, well, you get to reconcile that. You
Hmm.
get to do something with it. And now, hey, you have an opportunity here. So we can either choose to stew in what didn't happen or what was messed up, or we can choose to do something about that so we can get the fruits out of life that are owed to us.
Mm. I love that idea of having this aha moment, right? And realizing, oh, this is modeled behavior that I then adopted and adapted in
Mm-hmm.
myself. And the reason why I find that really exciting is because if this is modeled behavior that I learned, then I can learn another behavior.
I can unlearn it. Yep.
Yeah, that is very powerful, right? Because I think sometimes we can get really down on ourselves about maybe actions that we've taken or habits that we've repeated, or this is just the way I am, and we can feel powerless. But when we realize, like, oh, this is a learned behavior and it was maybe normalized in my family, my mom, my dad, aunts, uncle, everybody was like this. But when we realize actually it's harming us and we can then take steps to create a new behavior, a new pattern, a new perspective, that is really exciting. Like we don't have to continue living this way where we feel really down or, out of control or, whatever the case may be. And with the
Mm-hmm.
help of a mental health provider, we can actually find the strategies and try, right? Some different strategies or different tactics until we figure out, okay, this is actually what works best for me. And again, feels really good, helps me be the type of person that I want to be.
Yeah. And that even, for example, finances.
Mm,
I've seen a lot of people, and I've talked about this before where I'm like, ooh, I do not want to go back to before 27 years old. of age because I just didn't know what I was doing with my money. I would earn it and I would spend it. I would
Mm,
earn it and I could take care of my bills, but there was no strategy. There was no real saving. But I also recognized watching my mom, who did the best that she could and is an angel, didn't always have capacity or access to certain things to be able to teach my brother and I something or to do better. And I
mm,
think that a lot of, and I'm saying that to say, when we're looking at adult men's mental health, we're really looking at how our finances,
mm,
how is our physical fitness, how do we show up in relationships, starting with ourselves, right? So we're taking into account all of those things. And finances, whether we want to admit it or not, that makes or break how we feel.
mm,
Even just like a haircut makes or break how we can feel, how much money we have in our
mm,
accounts, and are we moving through life in a way where we would feel proud of ourselves. Oftentimes, I think we move in a way that we think we want our spouse or our parents to feel proud of us. But what about
mm,
me? I want to feel good and dope about the things that I'm doing, no matter if no one else can affirm that or not. I want to feel good
mm.
about it. And so that matters.
Wow. I mean, you said a lot right there, Justin. I mean, thinking about, and I think for men in particular, there's often this pressure like, if you're a provider, then it's okay, right? Like you're taking care of other people financially, then it's fine. And it's like, okay, well, what if I'm not fine though, right? What if I
Mhm.
am able to provide and maybe have, checked off that box of manhood, quote unquote, according to society, but what about
Yeah.
myself internally? And I think that's really important. And hopefully, even for folks listening, that might even give you permission to be like, yeah, like how I feel actually does matter. And it is important outside of what I can do for others or upholding this idea of, being a provider or even, being in good physical shape, right? But
Yeah.
emotionally, how am I feeling?
Yeah. And then also spiritually, what am I
Mm,
connected to? That's another pillar that we look at in therapy because I have to be connected to something, believe
mhm,
in something. Where is your moral compass? What is your value system? Do you have a higher being that you believe into? Where is the foundation? Where is the grounded place? For a lot of us, it's God,
mhm.
but that's not for everybody. And I
No.
recognize that. And you should be able to explore whatever you believe in the therapy room
Mm,
without being judged by somebody.
mhm. I think that is just such a beautiful reminder that within that therapy room, a space where you don't feel judged and where you can be honest with yourself, but then also honest out loud, right? I think there is something about, maybe we're able within our internal kind of monologue or internal dialogue, right? If you talk back to yourself, um,
Yeah.
but something about saying it out loud to someone who can witness and hear, but then also someone who can say back to you, oh, it sounds like XYZ, or maybe here's some strategies again, right? Like adding to that, those resources that you can then use. So I think that that is
Mhm.
really powerful. So again, that idea of, yeah, we can do a lot on our own for sure. But at a certain point, we realize, hey, actually, I need some expert professional guidance if
Yeah.
I want to take this to the next level, right? If I'm serious about investing in myself, and therapy can definitely be that space for sure.
Yeah.
For the men listeners who are like, okay, wait a minute, I think I heard something that kind of, struck a chord with me. What would you say to them? So they're listening to this episode, maybe for folks who've never been to therapy.
Yeah.
Any directives or words that you could kind of give them as they're considering, their next steps?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. First, really evaluate where you are in life and where do you feel satisfied or unsatisfied? Where do you feel in control, where you're crushing it, kicking ass versus where you're not? And then we want to identify how do we want life to look different? Oftentimes men are interested in the idea of therapy, but they really don't know what they want to work on. So then we're in this consultation call, which I offer a complimentary consultation call, my whole practice does, where you get to identify, all right, bet this is what I want to work on. But if you show up without knowing what you want to work on, it's hard to figure out where we go from here. We'll
Mm,
figure it out, but it really gives you the leverage and the momentum to start where makes what makes the most sense for you. So I
mhm,
would say start there and use that as leverage to identify some providers in your area, do a few different consultation calls to figure out who you vibe with, what makes the most sense. Can you sustain with what they offer for longer term for at least a few months? And know that the process is not going to be rushed. You can't just do 2-hour sessions and think that everything is going to be okay. You didn't get to how you are overnight. So changing then unlearning behaviors isn't going to be an overnight success. So I think that being realistic about that. And then if you choose not to do therapy, go back to steps 1 and 2 that I talked about and really check in with yourself. Build a community of people that make you feel good and restored. And also go to the doctor. Go get your blood work. You deserve to know what's going on in your body. If you don't know when the last time you had a physical or you got your teeth cleaned, do those things. At least start there.
I
Yeah.
love it. Very practical advice. Now, Justin, how can we get in touch with you or stay connected with you?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram at it's Dr. J Keith. In my practice, we're very exciting news. We're actually back in person offering both virtual and in-person sessions. I moved offices this year in 2024. And so we're really excited to be able to sit in the space with our clients again and pay attention to all the nuances that are happening in real time. So people can reach out to me on Instagram, it's Dr. J Keith, or visit our website, navigatingcouragecac.com to learn more. We have a few different clinicians that can hopefully meet your needs. And if not, we can always direct you to people that can.
I love it. Talk about a resource. Definitely look, tap into these resources. Well, Justin, it has been an absolute pleasure as always. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Dr. Justin K. Dodson. He is the owner of Navigating Courage Counseling and Consultation. So definitely, if you have been listening to this conversation and you're like, you know what, I think I do want to go ahead and give this therapy thing a try, make sure to tap into those resources and connect with Dr. Dodson and his team at Navigating Courage Counseling and Consultation. You know, anytime that Dr. Dodson and I are able to chat, I am so excited for the opportunity because I'm a firm believer in therapy. It is something that I have been in a therapeutic relationship, right? A one-on-one therapy sessions for the past couple years, and easily one of the top 5 decisions of my life. And this is coming from a person who is like, I don't know if I want to talk about my feelings. I don't think that's anybody's business. But let me tell you whose business it is. It is my business to be able to give myself the space to be honest with me and then be able to receive feedback from someone who has the strategies and the expertise to actually give me guidance on, again, just additional tools or resources as I do the work, right? As I make my own decisions and again, decide how I want to show up in the world and what type of person I want to be and to make those aligned actions as well. Well, this has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm here every Monday morning having very insightful and engaging conversations. Thank you so much for being here with me today. And if there is anything about this show where you're like, oh my goodness, this was so good, I have to share it with a friend, please do. You can subscribe to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format wherever you stream podcasts. Definitely subscribe, send this show to a friend, and also get into the previous conversations I've had with Dr. Dodson, as well as other shows as well. I'm guaranteeing you that there is going to be something that I have talked about and someone that I have talked with that is going to completely open up your world or maybe change your mind about something. I'm always excited when that happens for me. Well, I can't wait to be back with you next week. This is Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM Memphis.